I thought I was just getting a job, but it turns out I signed up for an experience at the Ohio Monster Diner. From unexplained noises to customers who aren't quite human, every second of the shift is a fight for, well, I'm not even sure what. Can I make it through the night? Or will I become another part of their special menu? The eviction notice crumpled in my sweaty palm as I scrolled through yet another page of job listings on my ancient laptop. 3 months of unemployment had drained my savings to nothing, and my landlord's patience had officially expired. The cursor blinked mockingly at me from the search bar, as if it knew how desperate I'd become. Every decent job required experience I didn't have, and every entry-level position paid wages that wouldn't even cover my monthly ramen noodle budget. That's when I saw it. Night shift server wanted, Ohio Monster Diner. No experience necessary. Excellent pay. Must be available 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Serious inquiries only. The posting was buried on page 7 of the job board, sandwiched between a sketchy door-to-door sales gig and an advertisement for medical test subjects. The pay listed made my eyes widen. $18 an hour, plus tips. In rural Ohio, that was practically executive salary for someone like me. The name, Monster Diner, seemed like typical roadside kitsch, probably some themed restaurant with plastic gargoyles and servers dressed like vampires. I clicked on the posting, expecting the usual corporate application portal with personality tests and background check requests. Instead, I found a single paragraph of text and a phone number. The Ohio Monster Diner seeks dedicated individuals for overnight service positions. Applicants must demonstrate reliability, discretion, and adaptability to unusual circumstances. Previous food service experience preferred but not required. Those selected for interviews will receive specific instructions. Call between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. only. The vague wording should have been my first red flag, but desperation has a way of dulling your survival instincts. I glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Perfect timing. The phone rang 6 times before a gravelly voice answered. No greeting, no company name, just a tired yeah. Hi, I'm calling about the night shift position at the Monster Diner. A long pause. I could hear what sounded like distant music, the kind of old jazz that plays in elevators. You available to start immediately? Yes, absolutely. Address is 4847, Highway 23, just past the old grain elevator. Be there tomorrow night at 10:30 sharp for orientation. Don't be late, and don't bring anyone with you. The line went dead before I could ask any questions. I stared at the phone, a cold knot forming in my stomach. That was either the most efficient hiring process in history, or I just agreed to something I didn't understand. But $18 an hour spoke louder than my growing unease. I spent the next day trying to research the Ohio Monster Diner online. The results were frustratingly sparse. A few mentions in local forums, mostly from truckers talking about weird but good food and interesting atmosphere. One review simply said, "If you know, you know. If you don't, maybe it's better that way." The diner's website was a single page with a vintage photo of a classic 1950s diner car, the kind of roadside establishment that time forgot. The address led me down a stretch of highway I had never traveled, despite living in the area my entire life. The road cut through dense woods that seemed to swallow my headlights. Mile after mile of towering pines and thick underbrush pressed against the asphalt, creating a tunnel effect that made me feel like I was descending into something rather than simply driving. At 10:25 p.m., I finally spotted the grain elevator the voice had mentioned, a massive concrete structure looming like a monument to agricultural ambitions long since abandoned. Just beyond it, a neon sign flickered against the darkness. Monster Diner in red cursive letters, with a cartoon dragon holding a coffee cup. The building itself was exactly what I'd expected from the website photo. A classic aluminum diner car, probably from the 1940s, sitting on a concrete foundation with a small parking lot. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows, and I could see the silhouettes of customers inside. It looked normal, even charming in a nostalgic way. I parked next to a rusted pickup truck and checked my appearance in the rearview mirror. Clean shirt, relatively fresh jeans, hair brushed. I looked like someone who needed this job, which was accurate enough. The front door chimed as I entered, a cheerful brass bell that seemed oddly loud in the quiet space. The interior was a time capsule of mid-century Americana. Red vinyl booths lined the windows. A lunch counter stretched along one wall, and the floor was a checkerboard pattern of black and white tiles. The smell hit me immediately: coffee, bacon grease, and something else I couldn't identify. Something sweet and cloying that made my sinuses tingle. 3 customers sat at different booths, each hunched over their meals in a way that obscured their faces. None of them looked up when I entered. Behind the counter, a woman with steel gray hair tied in a bun glanced at me with sharp blue eyes. "You must be the new hire," she said, wiping her hands on a well-worn apron. "I'm Dolores, the night manager. You're right on time." I introduced myself as Jamie, offering what I hoped was a confident smile. Dolores nodded curtly and gestured for me to follow her behind the counter. Up close, I could see that she was older than I'd initially thought, with deep lines around her eyes and hands that spoke of decades of hard work. "First things first," she said, pulling a manila folder from beneath the register. "This is your training manual. Read it tonight, memorize it, live by it. The rules exist for good reasons, even if they don't always make sense at first." I flipped open the folder, expecting typical restaurant policies about uniform standards and customer service. Instead, I found a collection of handwritten pages, some in different inks, some with notes scrawled in the margins. The first page was titled, "Essential Protocols for Night Shift Personnel." Rule number 1. Never serve coffee to customers wearing sunglasses after midnight. Rule number 2. If a customer orders the special, check with management before proceeding. Rule number 3. The jukebox plays only between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Do not attempt to operate it outside these hours. Rule number 4. Keep the lights in booth number 7 dim at all times. Rule number 5. If you hear scratching from the kitchen freezer, ignore it. I looked up at Dolores, expecting her to explain that this was some kind of joke or team-building exercise. Her expression was deadly serious. "I know it seems strange," she said, "but these rules have kept this place running for 60 years. Follow them exactly, and you'll do fine. Ignore them." She trailed off, shaking her head. "What happens if you ignore them?" I asked. Dolores was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if trying to determine something important. "Let's just say that the turnover rate used to be much higher before we started writing things down." She led me through the basic layout of the diner, showing me where the coffee supplies were kept, how to work the ancient register, and the location of various cleaning supplies. Everything seemed normal enough, except for the rules manual clutched in my sweating palm and the way Dolores kept glancing toward booth number 7, which remained empty despite the steady trickle of customers. "The morning shift comes in at 6 a.m. sharp," she explained. "Your job is to keep things running smoothly until then. Take orders, serve food, keep the coffee fresh, and follow the rules. Simple enough. What about the kitchen? Don't even know how to cook. Harold handles all the food preparation. He's been our night cook for 23 years. Just relay the orders to him, and he'll take care of the rest. Don't go into the kitchen unless absolutely necessary, and never, under any circumstances, look in the walk-in freezer." Another rule that wasn't written down. I was starting to see a pattern. Dolores checked the clock on the wall, which I noticed had Roman numerals instead of regular numbers. "I'll stay until midnight to help you get settled. Then you're on your own until morning. Think you can handle that?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. The $18 an hour was starting to feel less like generous compensation and more like hazard pay. But I needed this job, weird rules and all. "Good. Let's start with the coffee. That's 90% of what you'll be doing anyway." As Dolores showed me the coffee station, I caught a glimpse of the customer in booth number 3. He was wearing a heavy coat despite the warm night, and when he reached for his water glass, I saw that his hand was covered in what looked like gray fur. I blinked, and when I looked again, it appeared to be just an oddly colored glove. Must be the fluorescent lighting playing tricks on me. The next 2 hours passed relatively normally. I learned the register system, memorized the location of supplies, and served coffee to a steady stream of customers who seemed perfectly ordinary, if a bit antisocial. Most ordered simple items: coffee, pie, the occasional burger. None of them made much conversation, and I noticed that they all paid an exact change. At 11:45 p.m., a new customer entered. He was tall and thin, wearing a pristine suit that looked expensive even to my untrained eye. What caught my attention, though, were his sunglasses. Dark, wraparound lenses that completely obscured his eyes, despite the fact that it was nearly midnight. He slid into booth number 5 and raised one pale hand to get my attention. I grabbed the coffee pot and started toward his table, then froze as rule number 1 echoed in my mind: never serve coffee to customers wearing sunglasses after midnight. I glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Technically, it wasn't after midnight yet. The man in the suit tapped his fingers impatiently on the table, and I noticed that his fingernails seemed unusually long and pointed. Definitely just the lighting, I told myself, approaching his table with the coffee pot. "Good evening," I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "Coffee?" He tilted his head slightly, as if he was studying me despite the dark glasses. "Yes, black." I poured the coffee, watching the steam rise from the cup. The customer didn't move to remove his sunglasses, and up close, I could see that they weren't just dark lenses. They seemed to absorb light, creating an effect that made his entire face appear shadowed and indistinct. "Anything else?" I asked. "Not yet," he replied, and his voice had an odd quality to it, like it was coming from somewhere much deeper than his throat. "But I'll be staying until after midnight." The word sent a chill down my spine. I returned to the counter, hyper-aware of the customer in booth number 5 and the approaching midnight hour. Dolores was cleaning glasses with mechanical precision, occasionally glancing at the suited figure. "Dolores," I whispered, "that customer in booth 5. "I see him," she interrupted quietly. "When midnight hits, do not serve him anything else. If he asks for coffee, tell him the machine is broken. If he asks for food, tell him the kitchen is closed. No matter what he says or how he acts, do not give him anything." "Why? What happens if I do?" She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Some customers aren't here for the food, Jamie. They're here for something else entirely. The rules help us make sure they don't get it." The clock struck midnight with a series of deep, resonant chimes that seemed to reverberate through my bones. As the 12th chime faded, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The customer in booth number 5 was laughing. It wasn't a human laugh. Dolores finished drying the last glass and hung up her apron with the methodical movements of someone who had performed the same ritual thousands of times. The midnight hour had transformed the diner's atmosphere in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The warm yellow lighting seemed dimmer somehow, casting longer shadows that moved independently of their sources. The cheerful jazz music that had been playing softly through hidden speakers had stopped, leaving only the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the occasional rattle of the ancient air conditioning unit. "Remember," Dolores said, gathering her purse from beneath the counter, "follow the rules exactly as written. Harold is in the kitchen if you need anything, but try not to bother him unless it's urgent. The regulars know what they want, and they know how things work here. Trust your instincts, but trust the rules more." She paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. "Oh, and Jamie, if anyone asks about the basement, tell them it's been sealed for renovation since 1987. Don't elaborate." The door chimed her departure, leaving me alone with 3 customers and a growing sense that I'd stepped into something far beyond a simple waitressing job. The customer in booth number 5 hadn't moved since ordering his coffee, but I could feel his attention like a weight against my skin. His cup sat untouched on the table, the liquid now stone cold. I busied myself with unnecessary tasks, wiping down already clean counters and reorganizing the napkin dispensers. The training manual sat open beside the register, and I found myself constantly referring to its bizarre collection of rules. Some made a twisted kind of sense now that I'd been here for a few hours, while others remained completely mystifying. Rule number 8. If a customer complains that their food is too cold, do not offer to reheat it. Apologize and bring them a fresh order. Rule number 15. The payphone in the corner works only for incoming calls. If it rings, answer with Monster Diner. We're closed regardless of the actual time. Rule number 23. Never count the money in the register between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. At 12:30 a.m., a new customer entered. She appeared to be in her 50s, wearing a faded floral dress that might have been fashionable 30 years ago. Her gray hair was pulled back in an elaborate style that belonged to another era entirely. She moved with the careful, measured steps of someone navigating in near darkness, even though the diner was reasonably well lit. "Good evening, dear," she said, settling into booth number 2. Her voice was pleasant, grandmotherly, but there was something off about her enunciation. Each word seemed to require extra effort, as if speaking wasn't entirely natural to her. "Evening," I replied, grabbing a menu and approaching her table. "Coffee?" "Oh yes, please. And I'll have my usual." I paused, pot half-waiter cup. "I'm sorry, I'm new here. What's your usual?" She looked at me then, really looked, and I realized her eyes were completely white. Not the milky white of cataracts, but the pure, blank white of fresh snow. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things wrong. But when I looked again, her eyes were perfectly normal, a warm brown that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "The midnight special, dear. Harold knows how I like it." The midnight special wasn't on the menu I'd been given, but I wrote it down anyway and filled her coffee cup. She wrapped her hands around the mug as if trying to absorb its warmth, and I noticed that her skin looked strangely translucent in the diner's artificial light. Back at the kitchen pass, I called out the order to Harold. I'd only glimpsed the night cook briefly during my orientation, a heavy-set man with arms like tree trunks and a permanent scowl. He appeared at the window now, wiping his hands on a towel that had seen better days. "Midnight special for Eleanor," I said. Harold nodded without surprise, as if this was the most normal order in the world. "Tell her it'll be 15 minutes, and remind her about the extra charge for the special preparation." I returned to Eleanor's table, delivering Harold's message. She nodded serenely, continuing to stare into her coffee cup as if it contained secrets of the universe. "Of course, dear. Put on my tab." The next hour passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy, punctuated by moments that made my skin crawl. The customer in booth number 5 finally left, placing exact change on the table without ever touching his coffee. As soon as the door chimed his exit, I felt a physical relief, as if a pressure I hadn't realized I was carrying had suddenly lifted. Eleanor's midnight special turned out to be a plate of food I couldn't quite identify. It looked like some kind of meat, but the texture was wrong, and it had an odd, iridescent quality that shifted in the light. She ate it with obvious enjoyment, making small sounds of appreciation that seemed louder than they should have been in the quiet diner. At 1 a.m. exactly, the jukebox in the corner sprang to life without anyone approaching it. The sudden burst of music made me jump, nearly dropping the coffee pot I was refilling. The song was something from the 1940s, a slow, melancholy ballad about lost love and distant shores. The voice was hauntingly beautiful, but there was something not quite right about it, as if the singer wasn't entirely human. I checked rule number 3 again. The jukebox plays only between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Do not attempt to operate it outside these hours. Apparently, it operated itself during the designated time frame. A trucker entered around 1:30, a big man with calloused hands and tired eyes. He looked perfectly normal compared to the night's previous customers, and I felt my shoulders relax slightly as I served him coffee and took his order for eggs and hash browns. He paid with crumpled bills and made small talk about road conditions and weather, blessedly ordinary conversation that helped anchor me to reality. But as he was leaving, he paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "First night?" he asked. "Is it that obvious?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're still looking at everything like you expect it to make sense. Give it a few more shifts. This place has its own logic. Have you been coming here long?" 20 years, give or take. The food's good, and they don't ask questions. He glanced around the diner, his gaze lingering on booth number 7, which remained conspicuously empty despite the steady stream of customers. Word of advice: the rules aren't suggestions. They're not even really rules when you get down to it. They're more like safety protocols. He left before I could ask what he meant, but his words echoed in my mind as I continued working. Safety protocols. That implied danger, and I was beginning to understand that whatever kind of danger existed in this place, it wasn't the usual restaurant hazards of hot grease and sharp knives. At 2:15 a.m., I had my first real test. A young man entered, probably in his early 20s, wearing clothes that looked expensive but somehow wrong. The fabric seemed too perfect, too unwrinkled, as if it had never been worn before. He was attractive in an unsettling way, with features that were almost too symmetrical, like a computer-generated image of the perfect human face. He slid into booth number 6, directly adjacent to the perpetually empty booth number 7, and immediately I felt the atmosphere in the diner change. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the jukebox, which had been playing a cheerful swing number, switched to something slow and discordant. "Good morning," he said when I approached with a coffee pot. His voice was pleasant, cultured, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "I'd like to try something special tonight. What can I get you? I've heard you have items that aren't on the regular menu. Things that are unique to this establishment." His smile was perfect, revealing teeth that were too white and slightly too sharp. "I'm particularly interested in what you might have that's fresh." A chill ran down my spine. Fresh what? I thought of Harold's earlier comment about the special preparation for Eleanor's order, and suddenly I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was being prepared in the kitchen. "I can check with the cook," I offered, backing away from the table. "Please do, and tell him that I'm willing to pay extra for quality." At the kitchen pass, Harold appeared before I could even call out. His expression was grim as he looked past me toward booth number 6. "He's asking about special items," I whispered. Harold's face darkened. "What exactly did he say?" I repeated the conversation, watching Harold's expression grow more concerned with each word. When I finished, he shook his head slowly. "Tell him we don't have anything fresh tonight. Everything's been sitting too long. Offer him something from the regular menu instead." "But what if he insists?" "Then you stick to what I told you. We don't have anything fresh." Harold's voice carried a weight that made it clear this wasn't open for negotiation. "And Jamie, don't let him convince you otherwise, no matter how persuasive he might be. Some customers will try to talk you into breaking the rules. Don't let them." I returned to booth number 6, my hands slightly shaky as I delivered Harold's message. The young man's perfect smile flickered for just a moment, and in that instant, I saw something behind his eyes that made my breath catch. Hunger, but not for food. "How disappointing," he said finally. "I was so looking forward to sampling your hospitality." The way he said the word made it sound like a threat. "Perhaps I'll try again another night when you're better prepared." He stood and walked toward the door, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost inhuman. As he passed booth number 7, he paused and looked directly at the empty space, as if seeing something I couldn't. Then he smiled that too perfect smile and continued out into the night. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out in a shaky exhale. Whatever I just witnessed, I was certain that Harold's advice had saved me from something terrible. The rules weren't just bizarre restaurant policies. They were protection against customers who wanted more than food. The rest of the night passed more quietly, though I remained on edge. Eleanor finished her meal and left a generous tip, patting my hand with her oddly cold fingers and telling me I was doing well for a first night. A few more truckers came and went, all of them ordinary enough to provide blessed relief from the evening's stranger encounters. At 3 a.m., the jukebox fell silent mid-song, the sudden quiet almost deafening. The diner felt different without the background music, more isolated, as if we'd been cut off from the rest of the world entirely. I found myself checking the parking lot through the windows every few minutes, reassured by the sight of cars passing on the highway, proof that normal life continued beyond these walls. Harold appeared at the pass around 4 a.m., looking as tired as I felt. "You doing all right out there?" "I think so. Is it always like this?" He considered the question carefully. "Tonight was actually pretty quiet. You handled the difficult customer well. Many people would have tried to accommodate his request. What would have happened if I had?" Harold's expression grew dark. "Nothing good. The fresh items he was asking about. Let's just say they're not the kind of thing that ends up on a menu. Some of our customers have appetites that go beyond food." I thought about the young man's predatory smile and the way he'd looked at the empty booth. What was he? "That's not the right question," Harold said. "The right question is, what was he hunting for, and why did our rules keep him from finding it?" Before I could ask for clarification, he disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a growing understanding that the Ohio Monster Diner was exactly what its name suggested, a place where monsters came to feed. The only question was what exactly they were feeding on, and how long the rules would keep me from finding out firsthand. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward dawn, each minute bringing me closer to the end of my first shift and the uncomfortable realization that despite everything I'd experienced, I was already planning to come back tomorrow night. The money was good, but more than that, I was curious. This place operated according to its own twisted logic, and I wanted to understand the rules that governed it, even if that understanding might be the most dangerous thing I could pursue. The second week of working at the Ohio Monster Diner had settled into a routine that I was still trying to convince myself was normal. I'd memorized the rules, learned the rhythms of the night shift, and developed a healthy respect for Harold's warnings about difficult customers. What I hadn't expected was how quickly I'd start to recognize the regulars, or how their peculiarities would begin to feel almost commonplace. Eleanor, the woman with the intermittently white eyes, arrived every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 12:30 a.m. She always ordered the midnight special, always sat in booth number 2, and always paid with silver coins that felt ice cold to the touch. I learned not to comment on the coins or ask questions about her meal, which continued to look like nothing I could identify, but smelled like copper and roses. The trucker named Dale came in most nights around 2 a.m., ordered black coffee and apple pie, and left newspapers from towns I'd never heard of. The headlines were always strange. Mysterious light seen over Millbrook Cemetery, or a local woman claims her shadow is acting independently. I'd started reading them during slow periods, though I wasn't sure I believed the stories they contained. But it was the customer who arrived on Thursday night that truly tested my understanding of what constituted normal at the Monster Diner. I was refilling the coffee station when the front door chimed, and I looked up to see a man who appeared to be in his 30s, wearing a well-tailored business suit. Nothing unusual about that. We got all kinds of late-night travelers. What made me pause was the way he moved. His steps were too precise, too measured, as if he was consciously thinking about each movement. He settled into booth number 4 and waited patiently for me to approach. Up close, I could see that his skin had an odd, waxy quality, and his hair was perfectly styled in a way that suggested it never moved, even in wind. "Good evening," I said, coffee pot in hand. "Coffee?" "Yes, please. Black." His voice was pleasant but flat, lacking the natural variations in tone that marked normal human speech. As I poured, he watched my movements with intense concentration, as if he was studying the way I held the pot, the angle at which I poured, the distance between cup and saucer. Anything else? I would like to place an order for food, but I have a question first. Do you prepare your meals using traditional cooking methods? I paused, unsure how to interpret the question. Traditional methods. Heat application. The use of fire or electrical heating elements to transform raw ingredients into cooked food. He spoke as if explaining a concept to someone who might not be familiar with it. Yes, we cook our food in the kitchen. His face lit up with what might have been excitement, though his expression remained oddly rigid. Excellent. I would like to observe this process. May I watch the preparation of my meal? Red flags went up immediately. Rule number 12. Never allow customers into the kitchen except in case of emergency. But more than that, something about his request felt fundamentally wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I'm sorry, health regulations don't allow customers in the kitchen, but I'd be happy to take your order and have our cook prepare it for you. He considered this for a long moment, tilting his head at an angle that was just slightly too far to look natural. I understand. In that case, I would like a hamburger, cooked on a grill, with fire. The way he said with fire made my skin crawl, but I wrote down the order and headed to the kitchen pass. Harold appeared immediately, as if he'd been waiting. Booth number 4 wants a hamburger, I said, cooked on the grill. He was very specific about the fire part. Harold's expression grew thoughtful. Did he ask to watch it being cooked? How did you know? Because he's been coming here for 3 months, and he asks the same question every time. His name is Peter, and he's... Harold paused, searching for words. Let's say he's new to a lot of things that most people take for granted. New to what? Being human. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized that Harold wasn't speaking metaphorically. Peter wasn't acting strange because he was eccentric or foreign. He was acting strange because he was literally learning how to be human. What was he before? I asked. Harold shrugged. Does it matter? He's not causing trouble. He pays his bills, and he's trying to fit in. The rules don't say anything about refusing service to customers who are new at being people. I glanced back toward booth number 4, where Peter sat perfectly still, his hands folded precisely in his lap. Is he dangerous? Probably. But not to us, as long as he's trying to learn. The dangerous ones are the ones who don't want to fit in, who see humans as prey or entertainment. Peter just wants to understand what it's like to eat food that's been cooked with fire. Harold disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard the sizzle of meat hitting the grill. The sound seemed to carry unusually far, and I noticed that Peter's head turned immediately toward the kitchen, his expression becoming even more focused. While Peter's burger cooked, another regular arrived. This one I'd started thinking of as the businessman, though I was increasingly certain that business wasn't his primary concern. He was always impeccably dressed, always polite, and always paid with cash that felt slightly warm to the touch. He never ordered food, just coffee, and he spent most of his time writing in a leather-bound notebook with what appeared to be a fountain pen that never seemed to run out of ink. Evening, Claire, he said as I approached his usual spot in booth number 3. I'd stopped correcting customers who got my name wrong after realizing that they all seemed to see me as someone slightly different than who I actually was. Coffee, please. And perhaps you could tell me, have there been any unusual incidents tonight? Customers behaving strangely, unexplained noises, that sort of thing. This was new. In the 3 weeks I've been working here, the businessman had never asked about other customers. Nothing out of the ordinary. Why? He looked up from his notebook, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something flickering behind his eyes, like firelight reflecting off glass. I'm what you might call a researcher. I study anomalous occurrences. This establishment has quite a reputation in certain circles. What kind of reputation? A place where the unusual is usual, where the rules of normal reality are somewhat flexible. He smiled, and his teeth seemed too numerous, as if his mouth contained more of them than should be possible. I find it fascinating, don't you? Before I could answer, Harold called out that Peter's order was ready. I excused myself and collected the plate, noting that Harold had prepared the burger exactly as requested, clearly grilled, with visible char marks from the flames. The smell was mouth-watering, perfectly normal except for a faint metallic undertone I couldn't identify. Peter's reaction when I set the plate in front of him was unlike anything I'd ever seen. His entire face transformed, not just with pleasure, but with something approaching religious awe. He stared at the burger for a full minute without moving, then carefully picked it up with both hands, examining it from every angle. "It was prepared with fire," he said, and his voice carried a note of wonder. "I can smell the combustion, see the molecular changes caused by heat application." He took a small bite, chewed slowly, and made a sound that was somewhere between a moan and a sigh. "Remarkable. The proteins have been denatured, the sugars caramelized. The chemical transformation is beautiful." I found myself strangely moved by his obvious joy in something as simple as a grilled hamburger. Whatever Peter had been before becoming human, he was experiencing cooked food for the first time, and his wonder was infectious. "I'm glad you like it," I said. "Like it?" He looked at me with wide eyes. "This is the most incredible thing I have ever experienced. To take raw matter and transform it with fire into something entirely new. Humans are remarkable creatures." As I walked away, I heard the businessman chuckling softly. "New arrival?" he asked when I passed his table. "Something like that. They're always the most interesting ones. So much enthusiasm for the mundane." He made a note in his book, though I suppose nothing is truly mundane when you're experiencing it for the first time. The rest of the night proceeded smoothly, if my definition of smooth had adjusted to include serving coffee to a woman whose reflection appeared to be about 30 years older than she was, and cleaning up after a customer who left behind what looked like flower petals but felt like scales when I swept them up. Around 4 a.m., a new customer entered who immediately set my nerves on edge. She was young, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair and clothes that looked like they belonged in a different century. But what bothered me most was the way she moved. Too fluid, too graceful, as if she was floating slightly above the ground rather than walking on it. She chose booth number 7. I froze behind the counter, coffee pot halfway to my lips as I'd been taking a sip. Rule number 4. Keep the lights in booth number 7 dim at all times. But there was another rule I'd memorized that hadn't made sense until this moment. Rule number 19. If someone sits in booth number 7, serve them immediately, but do not make eye contact. My hands trembled as I approached the booth. The lighting controls for that section were behind the counter, and I noticed they were already dimmed, but now I understood why. The woman, or whatever she was, seemed to absorb light. Even in the reduced illumination, shadows gathered around her like living things. "Coffee?" I asked, keeping my gaze fixed on the table surface. "No." Her voice was beautiful, like music played on crystal bells. "I'm looking for someone." A young man, perhaps mid-20s, attractive in an artificial way. He would have been here recently. I thought of the customer from my first night, the one who had asked about fresh items. "I'm not supposed to discuss other customers." She laughed, and the sound made the windows vibrate slightly. How refreshingly professional. "But I'm not asking as a customer. I'm asking as someone who needs to find him before he causes more trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that ends with missing persons reports and police investigations that lead nowhere." She leaned forward, and I caught a glimpse of her eyes in my peripheral vision. They were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface. "He's been feeding on the staff at other establishments, places without proper protections." The implication hit me like a physical blow. The young man had been hunting for prey, and I'd been a potential target. If not for Harold's intervention and the rules, I might have become one of those missing persons she mentioned. He hasn't been back, I said. Good. The protections here are stronger than most places. But he's persistent, and he's getting hungrier. If he does return, don't try to be a hero. Follow your rules exactly, and call for Harold immediately. She stood to leave, moving with that same impossible grace. As she passed the counter, she paused and looked directly at me for the first time. Her black eyes were like looking into deep water at night. Not empty, but full of things I couldn't comprehend. You're adapting well, she said. Most humans don't last more than a week before they convince themselves they're losing their minds. But you're accepting the reality of what this place is. What is this place exactly? A neutral ground. A place where different types of beings can coexist peacefully, as long as they follow the rules. The diner exists in the spaces between worlds, serving anyone who needs a meal and a moment of safety. She smiled, and her teeth were sharp but not threatening. Think of it as Switzerland for the supernatural community. After she left, I found myself staring at booth number 7 for a long time. The implications of what she'd said were staggering. This wasn't just a diner with strange customers. It was a sanctuary, a place where humans and non-humans could interact safely. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were a carefully crafted system for maintaining peace between species that might otherwise be predator and prey. Peter finished his burger and approached the counter pay. Up close, I could see that his skin had a healthier color than when he'd arrived, as if the cooked food had somehow made him more human. Thank you, he said, counting out exact change. This has been educational. Will we see you again? Oh yes. I have so much more to learn about being human. Next week, I would like to try something called pie. I understand it involves fruit that has been transformed by heat and combined with a substance made from ground grain. His childlike excitement about basic food concepts was endearing, and I realized that despite his inhuman origins, Peter was probably one of the least threatening customers I'd encountered. His desire to understand humanity seemed genuine, and his careful adherence to social norms suggested he was making a real effort to fit in. The businessman left shortly after, tipping his hat politely and leaving behind exact change plus a generous tip. His notebook remained closed, but I'd seen him making notes throughout the night, and I wondered what exactly he was researching. The woman in booth number 7 had mentioned that this place existed between worlds. Perhaps he was documenting the intersection points. By 5 a.m., the diner was empty except for me and the ever-present sounds from the kitchen where Harold was preparing for the morning shift. I used the quiet time to reflect on how much my understanding of the world had changed in just 3 weeks. A month ago, I would have dismissed stories about non-human beings as fantasy. Now I was serving them coffee and learning their preferences for how they liked their supernatural meals prepared. The morning shift arrived at exactly 6 a.m. 2 cheerful women in their 40s who chatted about normal things like soccer practice schedules and grocery store sales. Their mundane concerns felt surreal after a night of serving customers who might not technically be human. As I gathered my things to leave, Harold appeared from the kitchen with a knowing look. "You're starting to understand," he said. "I think so. This place is like a meeting ground." Something like that. The world is bigger and stranger than most people realize. There are beings that exist in the shadows, in the spaces between what humans consider normal. They need places to go, same as anyone else. The diner provides that, and the rules keep everyone safe. The rules keep everyone honest. They create a framework where natural predators can coexist with natural prey because everyone knows the boundaries. Break the rules, and you lose the protection they provide. I thought about the young man who'd asked about fresh items, and how quickly he'd left when denied. What happens to the ones who won't follow the rules? Harold's expression darkened. That's not really our problem. Our job is to maintain the sanctuary. What happens to those who violate it? Well, there are others who handle enforcement. Like the woman in booth number 7, I realized she hadn't been a customer at all. She'd been a hunter, tracking someone who'd broken the rules of the neutral ground. As I walked to my car in the pale dawn light, I found myself looking forward to my next shift. The Monster Diner was dangerous, certainly, but it was also fascinating. I was witnessing interactions between species that most humans never even suspected existed, and I was part of maintaining a delicate balance that kept both sides safe. The $18 an hour was still good money, but that wasn't why I'd be back tomorrow night. I'd be back because I was beginning to understand that I wasn't just serving coffee and taking orders. I was helping to maintain one of the most important institutions in the hidden world that existed parallel to human society. And despite the risks, despite the constant tension of not knowing which customer might be genuinely dangerous, I was proud to be part of something that mattered on such a fundamental level. Even if I still had no idea what was scratching the kitchen freezer, and I was beginning to suspect I was better off not knowing. 3 months into my employment at the Ohio Monster Diner, I developed a routine that felt as natural as breathing. I knew which customers prefer their coffee scalding hot versus merely warm, which booze to keep dimmed, and exactly how long to wait before approaching certain tables. What I hadn't learned was what Harold actually cooked in that kitchen, or why the walk-in freezer made sounds that definitely didn't come from any refrigeration equipment I'd ever encountered. That changed on a Tuesday night in October when Harold didn't show up for his shift. I arrived at 10:30 to find Dolores pacing behind the counter, her usual composed demeanor cracked with obvious worry. The kitchen was dark, and the familiar sounds of prep work were conspicuously absent. "Harold's sick," she said before I could ask. "Food poisoning, if you can believe the irony. He'll be out for at least 3 days." "What about the night menu? The special orders?" Dolores looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's what we need to discuss. I can handle the basic items, coffee, pie, simple sandwiches, but some of our regular customers have specific dietary requirements that I'm not equipped to manage, such as Eleanor's midnight special, for one. The preparation requires knowledge and ingredients that aren't exactly mainstream culinary techniques." She wrung her hands, a gesture I'd never seen from her before. "We could close for the week, but that would violate agreements that have been in place for decades." "What kind of agreements?" Before she could answer, the front door chimed, and Eleanor entered right on schedule. She moved with her usual careful steps, but I noticed she paused in the doorway, her head tilted as if listening for something. "Good evening, dear," she said to me, but her white eyes, completely white tonight, not the occasional glimpse I'd grown accustomed to, fixed on Dolores. "Where is Harold?" "He's ill," Dolores replied. "We're not sure we'll be able to prepare your usual order tonight." Eleanor's pleasant expression didn't change, but the temperature in the diner seemed to drop several degrees. "I see. How unfortunate." She settled into booth number 2 anyway, folding her hands on the table with deliberate precision. "Perhaps you could show Jamie the preparation method? It's not terribly complicated once you understand the principles involved." Dolores and I exchanged glances. The idea of me preparing Eleanor's mysterious meal was both terrifying and intriguing. I'd been wondering about the contents of that plate for months. "It's not that simple," Dolores said carefully. "The ingredients are specialized, but available," Eleanor replied, and there was something in her tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. "The arrangement has been honored for 60 years. I would hate for such a long-standing agreement to be broken over a temporary staffing issue." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Whatever the arrangement was, Eleanor considered it binding, and Dolores clearly agreed. After a long moment, the night manager nodded reluctantly. "Jamie, I need you to come with me to the kitchen. We'll improvise." The kitchen was larger than I'd expected from glimpses through the pass window. Industrial equipment lined the walls, grills, fryers, ovens, and refrigeration units that hummed with mechanical efficiency. But what caught my attention was the section Harold had always kept off limits, a specialized preparation area with equipment I didn't recognize. "The thing you need to understand," Dolores said, opening a cabinet that contained jars of substances I couldn't identify, is that not all of our customers digest food the same way humans do. Some require specific mineral content. Others need certain proteins that aren't found in conventional meat. She selected several jars, reading labels written in what looked like Latin, mixed with symbols I'd never seen. Eleanor is what you might call a transitional being. She exists partially in our world and partially in somewhere else. Her nutritional needs reflect that duality. What exactly am I about to prepare? Something that would appear to be meat to human eyes, but contains elements that don't technically exist in our dimension. Dolores began measuring ingredients with practiced precision. The preparation requires intention as much as technique. You have to understand what you're making and why it's necessary. She guided me through a process that defied everything I thought I knew about cooking. The meat came from a sealed container in a specialized freezer, and it looked normal until Dolores added the first jar of powder. The substance began to shimmer, taking on that iridescent quality I'd observed on Eleanor's previous meals. The key, Dolores explained, is maintaining the balance between worlds. Too much of the dimensional additive, and it becomes inedible to someone still partially anchored in human reality. Too little, and it won't provide the sustenance she needs. As we worked, I became aware of sound from the walk-in freezer. Not just scratching, but something that sounded almost like whispered conversation. The scratching I'd learned to ignore, but voices were new. "What's in the freezer?" I asked. Dolores paused in her measurements. Ingredients that require very specific storage conditions. Some things need to be kept not just cold, but isolated from certain types of energy that exist in normal space. Living ingredients? That's not the right question. Some things exist in states that don't map neatly to our concepts of living and dead. She added another powder, and the meat began to emit a faint glow. The important thing is that they're contained and controlled. We finished Eleanor's meal and plated it with the same careful presentation Harold always used. As I carried it to her table, I noticed that other customers had begun arriving. Peter, looking more human than ever but still studying his surroundings with scientific intensity. The businessman, already writing in his notebook, and several truckers I recognized as regulars. Eleanor accepted her meal with obvious relief, though she examined it more carefully than usual before taking her first bite. Her expression after tasting it was thoughtful, almost analytical. "Acceptable," she said finally. "Not quite Harold's standard, but adequate for my needs." She looked up at me with those unsettling white eyes. "You're learning quickly, dear. Most humans find it difficult to accept that reality has more flexibility than they were taught. It's definitely been an education." Indeed, and education often requires practical experience. She took another bite, and I noticed that the iridescent quality of the meat seemed to pulse in rhythm with her chewing. "Tell me, have you given any thought to what you'll do when Harold returns?" The question caught me off guard. Go back to taking orders and serving coffee, I assume. Perhaps, but you've now crossed a threshold that most humans never approach. You've prepared food for beings that exist between worlds. That knowledge changes you, whether you realize it or not. Before I could ask what she meant, the pay phone in the corner rang. Following rule number 15, I answered with a prescribed greeting. "Monster Diner, we're closed. Is this Jamie?" The voice was unfamiliar, male, with an urgent edge that made my pulse quicken. "Who's asking?" "A friend of Harold's. Listen carefully. You need to check the freezer. Something's wrong with the containment system." Harold would have noticed immediately, but with him gone, the line went dead, leaving me staring at the handset. Eleanor was watching me with increased attention, and I noticed that several other customers had stopped their conversations. "Problem?" Dolores asked, appearing at my elbow. "Someone called about the freezer. Said something about containment failure." The effect on the room was immediate. Conversation stopped entirely, and every customer turned to look at us. The businessman closed his notebook and stood, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. Peter tilted his head in that peculiar way of his, as if listening to frequencies beyond human perception. "We need to check," Dolores said, her voice tight with worry. The walk to the kitchen felt longer than it should have. The sound from the freezer had grown louder. Definitely voices now, speaking in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood, were expressing frustration and growing anger. Dolores opened a panel beside the freezer door, revealing gauges and displays that belonged more in a laboratory than a restaurant. Several of the readouts were flashing red, and warning lights pulsed in patterns that seemed designed to induce anxiety. "The dimensional anchors are failing," she muttered, making adjustments to controls I couldn't begin to understand. "Without proper containment, some of our stored ingredients could become problematic." "Problematic how?" Before she could answer, something inside the freezer began pounding against the door. Not the random scratching I'd grown accustomed to, but deliberate, rhythmic impacts that made the entire freezer unit shake. "That's not good," Dolores said, which struck me as the understatement of the century. The pounding intensified, and I could hear other customers moving around in the dining room, chairs scraping against the floor, voices rising in what sounded like several different languages. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway, her usual grandmotherly demeanor replaced by something far more authoritative. "How long until full containment failure?" she asked Dolores. "At this rate, maybe 20 minutes. Eleanor nodded grimly and turned to me. "Jamie, I need you to understand something very important. What's stored in that freezer isn't just exotic food ingredients. Some of those items are there because they're too dangerous to exist freely in this dimension." "What kind of dangerous?" "The kind that considers humans a delicacy," the businessman said, entering the kitchen behind Eleanor. Up close, I could see that his perfectly mundane appearance was just a facade. His eyes held depths that spoke of intelligence far beyond human understanding, the kind that can reshape reality according to their hunger. As if in response to his words, the freezer door bulged outward, metal groaning under pressure that should have been impossible. Whatever was inside was getting stronger, or more numerous, or both. "What do we do?" I asked. Eleanor and the businessman exchanged a look that communicated volumes without words. Then Eleanor turned to me with an expression that was equal parts apology and determination. "We're going to have to ask you to do something that no human should ever have to do," she said. "But you're the only one here who might be able to reset the containment system." "Why me?" "Because you prepare my meal tonight. The process requires someone who has willingly participated in the dimensional bridging that keeps this place functioning." She gestured toward the failing control panel. "The reset mechanism responds to intention and understanding. You now have both." The freezer door buckled again, and I could see hairline cracks spreading across its surface. Inside, the voices were growing louder, more coherent, and definitely more angry. "What happens if I can't do it?" The businessman smiled grimly. "Then we evacuate the diner and hope that whatever emerges doesn't decide to explore the wider world." Looking at the failing containment system, at the concerned faces of beings that probably had the power to level cities, I realized that my job description had just expanded far beyond serving coffee and memorizing bizarre rules. I was about to become the person standing between whatever was in that freezer and the unsuspecting human world beyond these walls. And despite the terror coursing through my veins, I was surprised to find that I was ready to try. The containment failure alarms created a symphony of electronic distress that seemed to resonate in frequencies, both audible and otherwise. As I approached the failing control panel, I could feel the energy radiating from the freezer. Not just cold, but something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. The pounding from inside had evolved into a rhythmic pattern that sounded almost like Morse code. If Morse code could be tapped out by something with far too many appendages. Eleanor stood beside me, her grandmother facade completely abandoned now. Her white eyes seemed to glow with their own light, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the air vibrate. The reset sequence requires 3 components, she explained, indicating different sections of the control panel. Physical interaction with the dimensional anchors, mental focus on the containment parameters, and emotional acceptance of what you're protecting the world from. What exactly am I protecting the world from? The businessman answered from behind us, his notebook now closed and his expression grimmer than I'd ever seen it. Entities that exist in the spaces between realities. Things that fell through cracks in existence and got stuck. Harold's been feeding them just enough to keep them dormant. But containment failure means they'll start looking for other food sources, such as human consciousness. Eleanor said matter-of-factly, they don't just eat flesh, they consume memories, experiences, the essential energy that makes a person who they are. One of them loose in a populated area would be catastrophic. The freezer door buckled outward another inch, and I could see something pressing against the metal from the inside, something that left impressions that hurt to look at directly, shapes that my mind refused to process properly. How do I do the reset? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Eleanor guided my hands to 3 different controls. First, you need to reestablish the dimensional anchors. These maintain the barriers between our reality and theirs. She pointed to a series of crystalline switches that hummed with barely contained energy. But you can't just flip them. You have to understand what you're doing and why it matters. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood anything about what was happening. The first switch felt warm under my fingers, almost alive, and as I activated it, I could sense something shifting in the fabric of reality around the freezer. The pounding inside became more frantic, and new voices joined the chorus of whatever was contained within. Second, Eleanor continued, you need to reset the containment parameters. This involved a complex series of dials and gauges that seemed to measure things that shouldn't be quantifiable. Degrees of existence, levels of dimensional stability, concentrations of what the labels called reality displacement. As I adjusted the controls according to Eleanor's instructions, I began to understand that the Monster Diner wasn't just a meeting place for unusual beings. It was a carefully maintained bubble of altered reality, a space where the normal rules of existence were deliberately bent to accommodate creatures that couldn't survive in standard dimensional conditions. Third, Eleanor said, her voice taking on an urgent edge as the freezer door developed a crack that leaked something that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite darkness. You need to accept responsibility for what you're containing. What does that mean? It means acknowledging that you're now part of the system that keeps these entities isolated. It means understanding that their hunger is real, their power is real, and your role in maintaining their prison is real. Her white eyes fixed on mine with uncomfortable intensity. Are you prepared to accept that responsibility? The crack in the freezer door widened, and something that might have been an appendage pushed through, something that shifted between tentacle and claw, and geometries that made my brain hurt to contemplate. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted, and frost began forming on every surface. I accept, I said, and meant it. The moment the words left my mouth, something fundamental shifted. The control panel responded to my touch in ways it hadn't before, the displays showing readings that suddenly made intuitive sense, even though I'd never seen them before. I could feel the entities in the freezer as distinct presences, hungry and ancient, and absolutely alien to human existence. But I could also feel the containment system responding, reality reasserting itself around the breach, the dimensional anchors locking back in a place with resonant harmonics that made my bones vibrate. The crack in the freezer door began to seal, and the appendage withdrew with what sounded like frustrated shrieking. Well done, Eleanor said, and for the first time since I'd known her, She sounded genuinely relieved. The crisis passed, but its aftermath left the entire diner changed. The customers who had gathered in the kitchen didn't return to their usual seats. Instead, they formed a loose circle around me, their expressions ranging from respectful to curious to something approaching reverence. "You realize what this means?" the businessman asked, his too perfect human facade flickering slightly to reveal something with far too many angles. "Not really," I admitted. "It means you're no longer just staff," Eleanor explained. "You're now part of the diner's essential functioning. The containment system has bonded with your life force. You're literally part of what keeps this place stable." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "Are you saying I can't leave?" "Not exactly," Peter said, speaking up for the first time since the crisis began. His voice carried new undertones, as if the experience had accelerated his transformation into something more fully human. "But you're connected to this place now in ways that go beyond employment. The entities in the freezer will respond to your presence, your emotional state, your intentions." I thought about what this meant for my life outside the diner. My tiny apartment, my few friends, my dreams of eventually finding a career that didn't involve serving coffee to potentially dangerous supernatural beings. "What happens if I try to quit?" "The containment system weakens," Eleanor said bluntly. "Not immediately, but gradually. Harold has been the primary anchor for 40 years, but he's getting older, and the bond has been fraying. Tonight proved that we need additional stabilization. So I'm trapped here." "You're needed here," the businessman corrected gently. "There's a difference. You could leave. The system wouldn't fail immediately. But eventually, without proper maintenance and anchoring, the containment would break down completely." I looked around at the faces surrounding me. Eleanor with her white eyes and ageless wisdom, Peter with his eager curiosity about humanity, the businessman with his careful documentation of supernatural phenomena, even Dolores with her decades of quiet service, maintaining the delicate balance of this strange place. "What about Harold? When he comes back, he'll still be the primary anchor," Eleanor assured me. "But having a secondary stabilizer will extend the diner's operational lifespan indefinitely." And she paused, studying my face. "Harold won't live forever. Someone needs to be trained to take his place eventually." The weight of that statement settled over me. Not just a job, but a calling. Not just serving strange customers, but maintaining a critical piece of infrastructure that kept dangerous entities contained and provided sanctuary for beings caught between worlds. The pay increases substantially. Dolores mentioned, ever practical. Hazard pay, plus bonuses for containment maintenance, plus a housing allowance since you'll need to live within a certain radius of the diner. I almost laughed at the normalcy of discussing salary negotiations while standing in a kitchen where we just prevented interdimensional entities from escaping into the world. But that was the nature of this place. The extraordinary made mundane through routine and necessity. "If I agree to this," I said slowly, "what exactly would my responsibilities be?" "Continue serving customers, maintaining the rules, and learning to monitor the containment systems," Eleanor said. "Harold will train you in the more specialized aspects: ingredient sourcing, entity management, reality stabilization techniques." "Entity management. The things in the freezer aren't the only ones we deal with," the businessman explained. "Some customers require more intensive service than others. The young man who asked about fresh items, for instance. He'll be back eventually. And when he is, we'll need someone capable of enforcing the rules more directly than just refusing service." The idea of confronting the predatory creature from my first week sent chills down my spine, but I realized that I'd already been doing exactly that. Every time I followed the rules instead of accommodating a dangerous request, every time I maintained the boundaries that kept predators and prey separate, I've been enforcing the peace that allowed this strange sanctuary to function. "I'll do it," I said. The relief in the room was palpable. Eleanor smiled. The businessman made a note in his book, and Peter tilted his head in that curious way of his, as if seeing me for the first time. "Welcome to the real job," Dolores said dryly. The rest of the shift passed quietly, though I noticed that my perception of the diner had fundamentally changed. I could feel the containment systems humming in the walls, sense the dimensional anchors that kept reality stable, and detect the subtle energy signatures of customers as they entered. Eleanor's meal tasted different to me now. Not just food, but a carefully crafted bridge between worlds that allowed her to maintain her existence in both realms simultaneously. When Harold returned 3 days later, he took one look at the modified control panels and grinned. "About time," he said. "I was wondering how long it would take for the system to choose a successor." "The system chose me. The system chooses everyone who works here, eventually. Some people it rejects. They can't handle the reality of what we do, or they refuse to accept the responsibility. But others," he gestured around the kitchen, at the humming equipment and the sealed freezer. "Others become part of something bigger than themselves." Over the following weeks, Harold taught me things that weren't in any culinary school curriculum. How to prepare meals for beings whose digestive systems operated on different physical laws. How to source ingredients from suppliers who existed partially outside normal space-time. How to maintain equipment that functioned on principles that defied conventional physics. But most importantly, he taught me about the responsibility I'd accepted. We're the guardians of a very delicate balance, he explained one night while showing me how to adjust the dimensional anchors. There are things in this world and outside this world that would love to upset that balance. Our job is to make sure they don't get the chance. What happens when you retire? Harold looked at me with an expression I'd learned to recognize. The look of someone who'd carried a heavy burden for decades and was finally seeing a way to share it. "Then you become the primary anchor," he said. "And hopefully, by then, you'll have found someone else to train as backup." Months later, I realized that I no longer thought about quitting. The Monster Diner had become more than a workplace. It was a calling, a responsibility, and surprisingly, a home. The customers weren't just strange beings to serve, but individuals with their own needs and stories. Eleanor with her gentle wisdom, Peter with his endless curiosity about humanity, the businessman with his careful documentation of the impossible. Even the entities in the freezer had become part of my reality. There contained hunger, a constant reminder of what I was protecting the world from. Sometimes I would stand beside the sealed door and listen to their whispered conversations in languages that predated human civilization, wondering what they had been before they became trapped between dimensions. The job had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I could see through certain types of illusions now, sense supernatural energies, and occasionally glimpse the true forms of customers who presented human facades. But perhaps most importantly, I found a purpose that went beyond simple survival. I was no longer just Jamie, unemployed college graduate desperate for work. I was Jamie, guardian of the space between worlds, keeper of the delicate balance that allowed humans and non-humans to coexist peacefully. The pay was excellent, the benefits were supernatural, and I was protecting the world from horrors it didn't even know existed. And despite the constant danger, despite the bizarre rules and impossible customers and things that scratched in freezers, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. After all, someone had to work the night shift at the Ohio Monster Diner, and I was surprisingly good at it.